Hello, everybody. How's everybody this afternoon? One friend watching. Okay, it's working. 2 friends. I feel like the count on Sesame Street. 1 friend. Wah ha ha ha. Everybody must be sleeping today. Taking an afternoon nap. Oh. Let me know if you're here. I'm having problems with my own computer, so I'm not sure if it's working yet. Okay, we've got 3 friends. That's good news. I haven't gone live on Instagram yet, just until I get my own fixed up, or else I won't be able to talk to any of you guys. Let's see if we can try this again. Oh, everybody's starting to get here. Perfect. Hi, everybody. I can't see your comments just yet. But let me know if you're here. So hopefully once my computer gets fixed up, I'll be able to see you. Oh, I see that Zoe's here. Okay, perfect. Okay, awesome. Whew. That was scary for a minute. Now I'll just load up our Instagram friends. Evelie's probably wondering where I am. She's always watching on Instagram. Instagram friends, let us know if you are here. Okay, perfect. Are you excited for today, guys? I still only see Zoe on Facebook, so hopefully some more friends are watching. But we're almost done. Holes. We're going to be reading for a little bit longer today because I think next week is when we're going to finish this whole book, which is going to be so awesome. Hopefully some more of my friends come in while we're talking about this first part. But does anybody... Hi, Gabe and Henry. Oh, hi, Hannah. I'm starting to see everybody now. Does anybody have their true and false answers from last week? If you don't have them, that's okay. I'll read the questions again, and then I'll tell you if they were true or false. But I thought we would start by doing that this week. If you remember, we did the true and false last week. Our first one was Stanley has bad luck because of his no good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing sister. And that was false, because we all know it's because of his no good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather, right? So that one was totally not true. The second one was Zero had water when he ran away from Camp Green Lake. And that was false, too. Hi, Emily! That was false. He left his canteen when he ran away, and the only thing that Zero took with him was his shovel, which was pretty crazy. Number 3, Zero is related to Madame Zeroni, and we know that's true because his last name is Zeroni. So that means Madame Zeroni is like his great-great-great-great-great-great-grandma or something like that. 4. Kissing Kate Barlow used to be a school teacher. And that's true. Kissing Kate Barlow used to be Miss Catherine. Or Miss Catherine. Miss Catherine, I think we've been calling her. Who was in love with Sam, the onion picker. The next one was Mary Lou was a horse. And that's false. Mary Lou's a donkey. Remember we were talking about that? Hi, Tracy! Remember we were talking about that the other day? How Mary Lou was actually a donkey. And we noticed that Mary Lou is the name of the boat that everybody was hiding underneath in the desert. That Stanley and Zero were hiding underneath. Now, since Sam was killed, there has been no rain at Camp Green Lake. That was true, too. There hasn't been any rain since he died. The most dangerous animal at Camp Green Lake are the rattlesnakes. And that's false. The most dangerous animal is the yellow spotted lizard. They are the worst one. Trout Walker has very smelly armpits. That one was false. He has very smelly feet. The warden wears cowboy boots with turquoise gemstones. And that's true. And we also know that Kissing Kate Barlow used to wear cowboy boots with turquoise gemstones in them, which is a cool coincidence. Miss Catherine made delicious canned peaches, and we know that is true. And then Stanley's great-grandfather took refuge on a place called God's Thumb, and that's true. And now where we're reading, Stanley thinks that that is the mountain in the distance of Camp Green Lake. That's where they're hiking towards. And then the last one was, are you liking this book so far? True or false? And I wrote true on mine. I hope you guys are liking it so far too. Awesome! Okay, I think we have almost everybody here. We can start reading. And we are on chapter 37. And what has happened is they were climbing the ledge out of the lake, and Zero has cut his hands holding onto the edge of the shovel when he pulled Stanley up out of the edge of the lake. So they're still walking, and now Zero has cut hands, which would really hurt. Chapter 37. We're almost there, said Stanley. He could see the base of the mountain. Now that they were really almost there, it scared him. Big Thumb was his only hope. If there was no water and no refuge, then they'd have nothing, not even hope. There was no exact place where the flatland stopped and the mountain began. The ground just got steeper and steeper, and then there was no doubt that they were heading up the mountain. Stanley could no longer see Big Thumb. The slope of the mountain was in the way. It became too steep to go straight up, and instead they zigzagged back and forth, increasing their altitude by small increments every time they changed directions. Patches of weeds dotted the mountainside, and they walked from one patch to another using the weeds as footholds. As they got higher, the weeds got thicker. Many had thorns, and they had to be careful walking through them. Stanley would have liked to stop and rest, but he was afraid that they'd never get started again. As long as Zero could keep going, he could keep going too. Besides, he knew they didn't have much daylight left. As the sky darkened, bugs began appearing over the weed patches. A swarm of gnats hovered around them, attracted by their sweat. Neither Stanley nor Zero had the strength to try to swat them away. "How are you doing?" Stanley asked. Zero pointed, thumbs up, and then he said, "If a gnat lands on me, it'll knock me over." Stanley gave him some more words. B-U-G-S, he spelled. Zero concentrated hard and then said, "Boogs." Stanley laughed. A wide smile spread across Zero's sick and weary face as well. "Bugs," he said. "Good," said Stanley. Remember, it's a short U if there's no E at the end. Okay, here's a hard one. How about L-U-N-C-H? Suddenly, Zero made a horrible wrenching noise as he doubled over and grabbed his stomach. His frail body shook violently and he threw up, emptying his stomach of the sploosh. He leaned on his knees and took several deep breaths, and then he straightened up and continued going. The swarm of gnats stayed behind, preferring the contents of Zero's stomach to the sweat on the boys' faces. Stanley didn't give him any more words, thinking that he needed to save his strength. But about 10 or 15 minutes later, Zero said, "Lunch." As they climbed higher, the patches of weeds grew thicker, and they had to be careful not to get their feet tangled in thorny vines. Stanley suddenly realized something. There hadn't been any weeds on the lake. "Weeds and bugs," he said. "Wait a minute, there's got to be water around somewhere. We must be getting close." A wide, clown-like smile spread across Zero's face. He flashed the thumbs up sign and then fell. He didn't get up. Stanley bent over him. "Come on, Zero," he urged. "We're getting close. Come on, Hector. Weeds and bugs. Weeds and boogs." Stanley shook him. "I've already ordered your hot fudge sundae," he said. "They're making it right now." But Zero said nothing. Chapter 38. Stanley took hold of Zero's forearms and pulled him upright, and then he stooped down and let Zero fall over his right shoulder. He stood up, lifting Zero's worn-out body off the ground. He left the shovel and the sack of jars behind as he continued up the mountain. Zero's legs dangled in front of him. Stanley couldn't see his feet, which made it difficult to walk through the tangled patches of weeds and vines. He concentrated on one step at a time, carefully raising and setting down each foot. He thought only about each step and not the impossible task that lay before him. Higher and higher he climbed. His strength came from somewhere deep inside him and also seemed to come from the outside as well. After focusing on Big Thumb for so long, it was as if the rock had absorbed his energy and now acted like a kind of giant magnet pulling him toward it. After a while, he became aware of a foul odor. At first, he thought it came from Zero, but it seemed to be in the air, hanging heavy all around him. He also noticed that the ground wasn't as steep anymore. As the ground flattened, a huge stone precipice rose up ahead of him, just barely visible in the moonlight. It seemed to grow bigger with each step he took. It no longer resembled a thumb, and he knew he'd never be able to climb it. Around him, the smell became stronger. It was the bitter smell of despair. Even if he could somehow climb Big Thumb, he knew he wouldn't find water. How could there be water at the top of a giant rock? The weeds and bugs survived only by the occasional rainstorm, like the one they'd seen from camp. Still, he continued toward it. If nothing else, he wanted to at least reach the thumb. But he never made it. His feet slipped out from under him. Zero's head knocked against the back of his shoulder, and he fell and tumbled into a small, muddy gully. As he lay face down in the muddy ditch, he didn't know if he'd ever get up again. He didn't know if he'd even try. He'd come all this way just to... You need water to make mud. Stanley crawled along the gully in the direction that seemed the muddiest, and the ground became gloppier. The mud splashed up as he slapped the ground. Using both hands, he dug a hole in the soggy soil. It was too dark to see, but he thought he could feel a tiny pool of water at the bottom of the hole. He stuck his head in the hole and licked the dirt. He dug deeper, and as he did so, more water seemed to fill the hole. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it. First with his fingers, and then even with his tongue. He dug until he had a hole that was as deep as his arm was long. There was enough water for him to scoop out with his hands and drop it on Zero's face. Zero's eyes remained closed, but his tongue poked out between his lips, searching for the little droplets. Stanley dragged Zero closer to the hole. He dug and then scooped some more water and let it pour out of his hands into Zero's mouth. As he continued to widen the hole, his hand came across a smooth, round object. It was too smooth and too round to be a rock. He wiped the dirt off of it and realized it was an onion. He bit into it without peeling it. The hot, bitter juice burst into his mouth. He could feel it all the way up to his eyeballs. And when he swallowed, he felt its warmth move down his throat and into his stomach. He only ate half, and he gave the other half to Zero. "Here, eat this." "What is it?" Zero whispered. "A hot fudge sundae," said Stanley. Cool! How do you think the onions got to the top of Big Thumb? Does anybody have an idea how the onions got up there? Chapter 39. I can't believe there was water up there, can you? Stanley awoke in a meadow, looking up at a giant rock tower. It was layered and streaked with different shades of red, burnt orange, brown, and tan. It must have been over 100 feet tall. Stanley lay a while just looking at it. He didn't have the strength to get up. It felt like the inside of his mouth and throat were coated with sand. And no wonder, when he rolled over and saw the water hole, it was about 2.5 feet deep and over 3 feet wide. At the bottom lay no more than 2 inches of very brown water. His hands and fingers were sore from digging, especially under his fingernails. He scooped some dirty water into his mouth and then swished it around, trying to filter it through his teeth. Zero moaned. Stanley started to say something to him, but no words came out of his mouth, and he had to try again. "How are you doing?" It hurt to talk. "Not good," Zero said quietly. With great effort, he rolled over, raised himself to his knees, and then crawled to the water hole. He lowered his head in and then lapped up some of the water. Then he jerked back, clutched his knees to his chest, and rolled to his side, and his body shook violently. Stanley thought about going back to the mountain to look for the shovel so he could make the water hole deeper. Maybe that would give them cleaner water. They could use the jars as drinking glasses. But he didn't think he had the strength to go down, let alone make it back up again, and he didn't know where to look for the shovel. He struggled to his feet. He was in a field of greenish-white flowers that seemed to extend all the way around the Big Thumb. He took a deep breath and then walked the last 50 yards to the giant precipice and touched it. "Tag, you're it." Then he walked back to Zero and the water hole. On the way, he picked up one of the flowers. It actually wasn't one big flower, he discovered, but instead, each flower was really a tiny cluster of flowers that formed a round ball. He brought it to his mouth, but he had to spit it out. He could see part of the trail he'd made the night before when he carried Zero up the mountain. If he was going to head back down and look for the shovel, he realized, he'd have to do it soon while the trail was fresh. But he didn't want to leave Zero. He was afraid that Zero wouldn't be okay when he was gone. Zero was still laying doubled over on his side. "I gotta tell you something," he said with a groan. "Don't talk," said Stanley. "Save your strength." "No, listen," Zero insisted. Then he closed his eyes and his face twisted with pain. "I'm listening." "I took your shoes," Zero said. Stanley didn't know what he was talking about. His shoes were on his feet. "That's all right," he said. "Just rest now." The kid who was carrying a pig up the hill every day. So that kid who was carrying the pig up the hill every day is Stanley's no-good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather. But that is a great guess. There might have been onions up there. But we also know that Sam lived near the lake, Sam the onion picker. So maybe Sam knew about the onions that were hidden on top of Big Thumb, because he always had the best onions that he was selling. And people said his onions had magical healing properties, and they were really special. "It's all my fault," said Zero. It's nobody's fault, said Stanley. I didn't know, Zero said. That's okay, Stanley said. Just rest. Zero closed his eyes, but then again he said, I didn't know about the shoes. What shoes? Stanley said. From the shelter. It took a moment for Stanley to comprehend. Clyde Livingston's shoes? I'm sorry, said Zero. Stanley stared at him. It was impossible. Zero was delirious. Zero's confusion seemed to bring him some relief. The muscles in his face relaxed and he drifted into sleep. Stanley softly sang him the song that had been in his family for generations. If only the woodpecker sighs, the bark on the trees was just a little bit softer, while the wolf waits below, hungry and lonely, he cries to the moon. If only, if only. Chapter 40. When Stanley found the onion the night before, he didn't question how it had come to be there. He ate it gratefully, but now as he sat gazing at Big Thumb and the meadow full of flowers, he couldn't help but wonder about it. If there was one wild onion, there could be more. He intertwined his fingers and tried to rub out the pain, and then he bent and dug up another flower, this time pulling up the entire plant, including the root. Onions! Fresh, hot, sweet onions! Sam would call as Mary Lou pulled the cart down Main Street. 8 cents a dozen! It was a beautiful spring morning. The sky was painted pale blue and pink, the same color as the lake and the peach trees along its shore. Mrs. Gladys Tennyson was wearing just her nightgown and robe as she came running down the street after Sam. Mrs. Tennyson was normally a very proper woman who never went out in public without dressing up in fine clothes and a hat, so it was quite surprising to the people of Green Lake to see her running past them. Sam! She shouted. Whoa, Mary Lou, said Sam, stopping his mule and cart. Good morning, Miss Tennyson, he said. How's little Becca doing? Gladys Tennyson was all smiles. I think she's going to be all right. Her fever broke about an hour ago, thanks to you. I'm sure Doc Hawthorne deserves most of the credit. Oh, yes, agreed Miss Tennyson. But not Doc Hawthorne. That quack wanted to put leeches on her stomach. Leeches! My word, he said they would suck out the bad blood. Now you tell me, how would a leech know good blood from bad blood? I wouldn't know, said Sam. It was your onion tonic, said Mrs. Tennyson. That's what saved her. Other townspeople made their way to the cart. Good morning, Gladys, said Hattie Parker. Don't you look lovely this morning? Several people snickered. Good morning, Hattie, Mrs. Tennyson replied. Does your husband know you're parading about in your bedclothes? Hattie said. There were more snickers. My husband knows exactly where I am and how I'm dressed. Thank you, said Mrs. Tennyson. We both have been up all night and half the morning with Rebecca. She almost died from the stomach sickness. It seems she ate some bad meat. Hattie's face flushed. Her husband, Jim Parker, was the butcher who sold the meat. It made my husband and me sick as well, said Mrs. Tennyson, but it nearly killed Becca, what with her being so young. But Sam saved her life. It wasn't me, said Sam. It was the onions. I'm glad Becca's all right, Hattie said. I keep telling Jim he needs to wash his knives, said Mr. Pike, who owned the general store. Hattie Parker excused herself and turned quickly and walked away. Tell Becca that when she feels up to it to come by my store for a piece of candy, said Mr. Pike. Thank you, I'll do that, said Mrs. Tennyson. Before returning home, Mrs. Tennyson bought a dozen onions from Sam and gave him a dime and told him to keep the change. I don't take charity, Sam told her, but if you want to buy a few extra onions for Mary Lou, I'm sure she'd appreciate it. All right then, said Mrs. Tennyson. Give me my change in onions. Sam gave Miss Tennyson an additional 3 onions, and she fed them one at a time to Mary Lou and laughed as the old donkey ate them out of her hand. Now we're back to the future. Stanley and Zero slept off and on for the next 2 days and ate onions. All they wanted, all the onions they wanted, and they splashed in the dirty water and drank it. They splashed the dirty water into their mouths. In the late afternoon, Big Thumb gave them shade. Stanley tried to make the hole deeper, but he really needed the shovel. His efforts just seemed to stir up the mud and make their water dirtier. Zero was sleeping. He was still very sick and weak, but the sleep and the onions seemed to be doing him some good. Stanley was no longer afraid that he might die from the sploosh. Still, he didn't want to go for the shovel while Zero was sleeping. He didn't want him to wake up and think he'd been deserted. He waited for Zero to open his eyes. "I think I'll go look for the shovel," Stanley said. "I'll wait here," Zero said feebly, as if he had any other choice. Stanley headed down the mountain. The sleep and the onions had done him a lot of good. He felt strong. It was fairly easy to follow the trail he'd made 2 days earlier. There were a few places where he wasn't sure he was going the right way, but it just took a little bit of searching before he found the trail again. He went quite a ways down the mountain, but still didn't find the shovel. He looked back up toward the top of the mountain. He must have walked right past it, he thought. There was no way he could have carried Zero all the way up the mountain from here. Still, he headed downward just in case. He came to a bare spot between 2 large patches of weed and sat down to rest. Now he'd definitely gone too far, he decided. He was tired from walking down the hill. It would have been impossible to have carried Zero up the hill from here, especially after walking all day with no food or water. The shovel must be buried in some weeds. Before starting back up, he took one last look around in all directions, and he saw a large indentation in the weeds a little farther down the mountain. It didn't seem likely that the shovel could be there, but he'd already come this far. There, lying in some tall weeds, he found the shovel and the sack of jars. He was amazed. He wondered if the shovel and sack might have rolled down the hill, but none of the jars were broken except for the one that had broken earlier. And if they'd rolled down the hill, it's doubtful that he would have found the sack and the shovel side by side. On his way back up the mountain, Stanley had to sit down and rest several times. It was a long, hard climb. I wonder how Stanley made it all the way up the hill the first time. He was so determined that he didn't even stop to rest. He was just worried about Zero and trying to take care of him. Chapter 41. Zero's condition continued to improve. Stanley slowly peeled an onion. He liked eating them one layer at a time. The water hole was now almost as large as the holes he dug back at Camp Green Lake, and it contained almost 2 feet of murky water. Stanley had dug it all himself. Zero had offered to help, but Stanley thought it was better for Zero to save his strength. It was a lot harder to dig in water than it was to dig in a dry lake. Stanley was surprised that he himself hadn't gotten sick, either from the sploosh, the dirty water, or from living on onions. He used to get sick quite a bit back home. Both boys were barefoot. They'd washed their socks and all their clothes, and they were very dirty, but their socks were definitely the worst. They didn't dip their socks into the hole, afraid to contaminate the water. Instead, they filled the jars and they poured the water over their dirty socks. "I didn't go to the homeless shelter very often," Zero said. "Just if the weather was really bad. I'd have to find someone to pretend to be my mom. If I'd just gone by myself, they would have asked me a bunch of questions, and if they found out I didn't have a mom, they would have made me a ward of the state." "What's a ward of the state?" Zero smiled. "I don't know, but I didn't like the sound of it." Stanley remembered Mr. Pendanski telling the warden that Zero was a ward of the state. He wondered if Zero knew that he'd already become one. "I liked sleeping outside," said Zero. "I used to pretend I was a Cub Scout. I always wanted to be a Cub Scout. I'd see them at the park in their blue uniforms." "I was never a Cub Scout," said Stanley. "I wasn't good at social stuff like that. Kids made fun of me because I was fat." "I liked the blue uniform," said Zero. "Maybe I wouldn't have liked being a Cub Scout either." Stanley shrugged one shoulder. "My mother was once a Girl Scout," said Zero. "I thought you said you didn't have a mother." "Everybody has to have a mother." "Well, yeah, I know that." "She said she once won a prize for selling the most Girl Scout cookies," said Zero. She was real proud of that. Stanley peeled off another layer of his onion. "We always took what we needed," Zero said. "When I was little, I didn't even know it was stealing. I don't remember when I found out, but we just took what we needed, and never more than that. So when I saw those shoes on display in the shelter, I just reached in the glass case and took them." "Clyde Livingston's shoes?" asked Stanley. "I didn't know they were his. I just thought they were somebody's old shoes. It was better to take someone's old shoes, I thought, than steal a pair of new ones. I didn't know they were famous. There was a sign, but of course I couldn't read it. And then the next thing I know, everybody's making this big deal about how the shoes are missing. It was kind of funny in a way. The whole place was going crazy, and there I was wearing the shoes, and everybody's running around saying, 'What happened to the shoes? What happened to the shoes? The shoes are gone.' I just walked out the door. No one noticed me. And when I got outside, I ran around the corner and immediately took off the shoes. I put them on top of a parked car. I remember they smelled really bad." "Yeah, those were them," said Stanley. "Did they fit you?" "Pretty much." Stanley remembered being surprised at Clyde Livingston's small shoe size. Stanley's shoes were bigger. Clyde Livingston had small, quick feet, and Stanley's feet were big and slow. "I should have just kept them," said Zero. "I'd already made it out of the shelter and everything. I ended up getting arrested the next day when I tried to walk out of a shoe store with a new pair of sneakers. If I'd just kept those old smelly sneakers, then neither of us would be here right now." Chapter 42. How crazy is that Zero's the one who stole the shoes from the shelter? He put them on top of a parked car, and then that person must have got in their car, and when they started driving, the shoes fell over the overpass and hit Stanley. And then the police happened to drive by when Stanley picked them up and was carrying them. That's definitely bad luck. Chapter 42. Zero became strong enough to help dig the hole. And when he finished, it was over 6 feet deep. He filled the bottom with rocks to help separate the water from the dirt. He was still the best hole digger around. "That's the last hole I'll ever dig," he declared, throwing down the shovel. Stanley smiled. He wished it were true, but he knew they had no choice but to eventually return to Camp Green Lake. They couldn't live on onions forever. They had been completely around Big Thumb. It was like a giant sundial they followed in the shade. Sorry, somebody's at my door. It was like a giant sundial. They followed the shade. They were able to see out in all directions. There was no place to go. The mountain was surrounded by desert. Zero stared at Big Thumb. "It must have a hole in it," he said, "filled with water." "You think?" "Where else could the water be coming from?" Zero said. "Water doesn't run uphill." Stanley bit into an onion. It didn't burn his eyes or nose, and in fact, he no longer noticed a particularly strong taste. He remembered when he had first carried Zero up the hill, how the air had smelled bitter. It was the smell of thousands of onions growing and rotting and sprouting. Now he didn't smell a thing. "How many onions do you think we've eaten?" he asked. Zero shrugged. "I don't even know how long we've been here." "I'd say about a week," said Stanley, "and we probably each eat 20 onions a day, so that's 280 onions, said Zero. Stanley smiled. "I bet we really stink." 2 nights later, Stanley lay awake staring up at the star-filled sky. He was too happy to fall asleep. He knew he had no reason to be happy. He had heard or read somewhere that right before a person freezes to death, he suddenly feels nice and warm, and he wondered if perhaps he was experiencing something like that. It occurred to him that he couldn't remember the last time he felt happiness. It wasn't just being sent to Camp Green Lake that had made his life miserable. Before that, he'd been unhappy at school where he'd had no friends, and bullies like Derek Dunn picked on him. No one liked him, and the truth was he didn't really like himself. But he liked himself now. He wondered if he was delirious. He looked over at Zero sleeping near him. Zero's face was lit in the starlight, and there was a flower petal in front of his nose that moved back and forth as he breathed. It reminded Stanley of something out of a cartoon. Zero breathed in, and the petal was drawn up, almost touching his nose, and Zero breathed out, and the petal moved toward his chin. It stayed on Zero's face for an amazingly long time before fluttering off to the side. Stanley considered placing it back in front of Zero's nose, but it wouldn't be the same. It seemed like Zero had lived at Camp Green Lake forever. But as Stanley thought about it now, he realized that Zero must have gotten there no more than a month or two before he did. A month or two before him. Zero was actually arrested a day later, but Stanley's trial kept getting delayed because of baseball. He remembered what Zero had said a few days before. If Zero had just kept the shoes, then neither of them would be here right now. As Stanley stared at the glittering night sky, he thought there was no place in the world he would rather be than right here. He was glad Zero put the shoes on the parked car. He was glad they fell from the overpass and hit him on the head. When the shoes first fell from the sky, he remembered thinking that destiny had struck him. Now he thought the same thing again. It was more than a coincidence. It had to be destiny. Maybe they wouldn't have to return to Camp Green Lake, he thought. Maybe they could just make it past the camp and then follow the dirt road back to civilization. They could fill the sack with onions and the 3 jars with water, and they had his canteen as well. They could refill their jars and canteens at the camp, maybe sneak into the kitchen and get some food. He doubted any counselors were still on guard. Everybody would probably think they were buzzard food. It would mean living the rest of his life as a fugitive because the police would be after him. At least he could call his parents and tell them he was still alive. But he couldn't go visit them in case the police were watching the apartment. Although if everyone thought he was dead, they wouldn't bother to watch the apartment. He would have to somehow get a new identity. Now I'm really crazy, he thought. He wondered if a crazy person wonders if he's crazy. But even as he thought this, an even crazier idea kept popping into his head. He knew it was too crazy to even consider, but still, if he was going to be a fugitive for the rest of his life, it would help to have some money. Perhaps a treasure chest full of money. You're crazy, he told himself. Hi, Brienne. Besides, just because he found a lipstick container with KB on it, that didn't mean there was treasure buried there. It was crazy. It was all part of his crazy feeling of happiness. Or maybe it was destiny. He reached over and shook Zero's arm. Hey, Zero, he whispered. Huh? Muttered Zero. Zero, wake up. What? Zero raised up his head. What is it? Do you want to dig one more hole? Stanley asked him. This will be the last chapter we read today, chapter 43. And then next week, we will finish this whole book. We weren't always homeless, Zero said. I remember a yellow room. How old were you when... Stanley started to ask, but he couldn't find the right words. When you moved out. I don't know. I must have been real little because I don't remember too much. I don't remember moving out. I remember standing in a crib with my mother singing to me. She held my wrists and made my hands clap together. She used to sing that song to me. The one you sang when I was on the mountain, but it was different. Zero spoke slowly as if searching his brain for memories and clues. And then later I know we lived on the street, but I don't know why we left the house. I'm pretty sure it was a house and not an apartment. I know my room was yellow. It was late afternoon. They were resting in the shadow of the thumb. They'd spent the morning picking onions and putting them in the sack. It didn't take long, but long enough so that they had to wait another day before heading down the mountain. They wanted to leave at the first hint of daylight so they'd have plenty of time to make it to Camp Green Lake before dark. Stanley wanted to be sure he could find the right hole, and then they would have to hide by it until everyone went to sleep. They would dig for as long as it seemed safe, and not a second longer. And then, treasure or no treasure, they'd head up the dirt road. If it was absolutely safe, They'd try to steal some food and water from the camp kitchen. I'm good at sneaking in and out of places, Zero had said. Remember, Stanley had warned, the door to the rec room squeaks. Now he lay on his back trying to save his strength for the long days ahead. He wondered what happened to Zero's parents, but he didn't ask. Zero didn't like answering questions. It was better to just let him talk when he felt like it. Stanley thought about his own parents. In her last letter, his mom was worried that they might be evicted from their apartment because of the smell of burning sneakers. They could easily become homeless as well. Again, he wondered if they'd been told that he ran away from camp. What did the warden tell them? An image appeared in his head of his parents hugging each other and crying, and he tried not to think about it. Instead, he tried to recapture the feelings that he'd had the night before. That inexplicable feeling of happiness and sense of destiny. But his feelings didn't return. He just felt scared. The next morning, they headed down the mountain. They dumped their caps in the water hole before putting them on their heads. Zero held the shovel and Stanley carried the sack, which was crammed with onions and the 3 jars of water. They left the pieces of the broken jar on top of the mountain. This is where I found the shovel, Stanley said, pointing out a patch of weeds. Zero turned and looked up toward the top of the mountain. That's a long way. You were late, Stanley said. You'd already thrown up about everything that was inside your stomach. He shifted the sack from one shoulder to another. It was heavy. He stepped on a loose rock, slipped, and then fell hard. And the next thing he knew, he was sliding down the steep side of the mountain. He dropped the sack, the onions spilled all around him. He slid into a patch of weeds and grabbed onto a thorny vine. The vine ripped out of the earth, but it slowed him enough so that he was able to stop himself. Are you all right? Zero asked from above. Stanley groaned as he pulled a thorn out of the palm of his hand. Yeah, he said. He was all right. He was worried more about the jars of water. Zero climbed down after him, retrieving the sack along the way. Stanley pulled some thorns out of his pant legs. The jars hadn't broken. The onions had protected them like styrofoam packing material. Glad you didn't do that when you were carrying me, Zero said. They'd lost about a third of the onions, but they recovered many of them as they continued down the mountain. And when they reached the bottom, the sun was just rising above the lake. They walked directly toward it. I was pretty lucky that none of the jars broke. Soon they stood on the edge of a cliff looking down at the dry lake bed. Stanley wasn't sure, but he thought he could see the remains of Mary Lou off in the distance. You thirsty? Stanley asked. No, said Zero. How about you? No, Stanley lied. He didn't want to be the first one to take a drink. Although they didn't mention it, it had become kind of a challenge between him and Zero. They climbed down into the frying pan. It was a different spot from where they had climbed up, and they eased themselves down from one ledge to another and let themselves slide in other places, being especially careful with the sack. Stanley could no longer see Mary Lou, but headed in what he thought was the right direction. As the sun rose, so did the familiar haze of heat and dirt. You thirsty? Zero asked. No, said Stanley. Because you have 3 full jars of water, said Zero. I thought maybe it was getting too heavy for you. If you drink some, it'll lighten your load. I'm not thirsty, said Stanley. But if you want a drink, I'll give you some. I'm not thirsty, said Zero. I was just worried about you. Stanley smiled. I'm a camel, he said. They walked for what seemed like a very long time and still never came across Mary Lou. Stanley was pretty sure they were heading in the right direction. He remembered that when they left the boat, they were headed toward the setting sun, and now they were headed toward the rising sun. He knew that the sun didn't rise and set exactly in the east and west, more like southeast and southwest, but he wasn't sure how that made a difference. His throat felt as if it was coated with sandpaper. You sure you're not thirsty? He asked. Not me, said Zero. His voice was dry and raspy. When they did finally take a drink, they agreed to do it at the same time. I think Emily's giving me thumbs up. Zero, who was now carrying the sack, set it down and took out 2 jars, giving one to Stanley. They decided to save the canteen for last, since it couldn't accidentally break. You know, I'm not thirsty, Stanley said as he unscrewed the lid. I'm just drinking so you will. I'm just drinking so you will, said Zero. And they clinked the jars together and, each watching the other, poured the water into their stubborn mouths. Zero was the first to spot Mary Lou, maybe a quarter of a mile away, and just a little off to the right. They headed for it. It wasn't even noon yet when they reached the boat. They sat against the shady side and rested. I don't know what happened to my mother, Zero said. She left and never came back. Stanley peeled an onion. She couldn't always take me with her, Zero said. Sometimes she had to do things by herself. Stanley had the feeling that Zero was explaining things to himself. She'd tell me to wait in a certain place for her, and when I was real little, I had to wait in small areas like a porch step or a doorway, and she'd say, oh, hopefully Instagram came back. Give me a thumbs up if you came back, Instagram. We only have a couple pages left. I'd have to wait in small areas like on a porch step or a doorway. She'd say, now don't leave here until I get back. I never liked it when she left. I had a stuffed animal, a little giraffe, and I'd hug it the whole time she was gone. Okay, awesome. When I got bigger, I was allowed to stay in bigger areas, like stay on this block or don't leave this park. But even then, I still held Jaffe. Stanley guessed that Jaffe was the name of Zero's giraffe. And then one day, she didn't come back, Zero said. His voice sounded suddenly hollow. I waited for her at Laney Park. Laney Park, said Stanley. I've been there. You know the playscape, said Zero. Yeah, I played on it. I waited there for more than a month, said Zero. You know that tunnel that you crawl through between the slide and the swinging bridge? That's where I slept. They ate 4 onions apiece and drank about a half a jar of water. Stanley stood up and looked around. Everything looked the same in all directions. When I left camp, I was heading straight toward Big Thumb, he said. I saw the boat off to the right, so that means we have to turn a little to the left. Zero was lost in thought. What? Oh, okay, he said. They headed out. It was Stanley's turn to carry the sack. Some kids had a birthday party, Zero said. I guess it was about 2 weeks after my mother left. There was a picnic table next to the playscape and balloons were tied to it. The kids looked to be about the same age as me. One girl said hi to me and asked me if I wanted to play. I wanted to, but I didn't. I knew I didn't belong at the party, and even though it wasn't their playscape, there was this one mother who kept staring at me like I was some kind of monster. And then later a boy asked me if I wanted a piece of cake, but then the same mother told me, go away! And she told all the kids to stay away from me, so I never got that piece of cake. I ran away so fast I forgot Jaffe. Did you ever find him? For a moment, Zero didn't answer, and then he said, he wasn't real. Stanley thought again about his own parents, how awful it would be for them to never know where he was. He realized that was how Zero must have felt, not knowing what happened to his own mother. He wondered why Zero never mentioned his father. Hold on, Zero said, stopping abruptly. We're going the wrong way. No, this is right, said Stanley. You were heading toward Big Thumb when you saw the boat off to your right, said Zero, and that means we should have turned right when we left the boat. You sure? Zero drew a diagram in the dirt. And look, there's even a diagram in the book. Camp Green Lake, you went straight, he turned right. They went to the Thumb, and now they're accidentally going this way instead of this way. Stanley still wasn't sure. We need to go this way, Zero said, first drawing a line on the map and then heading that way himself. Stanley followed, but it didn't feel right to him, but Zero seemed sure. Sometime in the middle of the afternoon, a cloud drifted across the sky and blocked out the sun. It was a welcome relief. Once again, Stanley felt that destiny was on his side. Zero stopped and held out his arm to stop Stanley too. Listen, Zero whispered. Stanley didn't hear anything. They continued walking very quietly, and Stanley began to make out the faint sounds of Camp Green Lake. They were still too far away to see the camp, but he could hear a blend of indistinct voices. As they got closer, he occasionally could hear Mr. Sir's derisive bark. They walked slowly and quietly, aware that sounds travel in both directions. They approached a cluster of holes. "Let's wait here until they go in," said Zero. Stanley nodded. He checked to make sure that there was nothing living in it and then climbed down into a hole. Zero climbed into the one next to him. Despite having gone the wrong way for a while, it hadn't taken them nearly as long as Stanley had expected, and now they just had to wait. The sun cut through the cloud, and Stanley felt its rays beating down on him. But soon, more clouds filled the sky, shading Stanley and his hole. He waited until he was certain the last of the campers had finished for the day. Then he waited a little longer. As quietly as possible, he and Zero climbed up out of their holes and crept toward camp. Stanley held the sack in front of him, cradled in his arms, instead of over his shoulder to keep the jars from clanking against each other. A wave of terror rushed over him when he saw the compound, the tents, the rec room, the warden's cabin under the 2 oak trees. The fear made him dizzy. He took a breath, summoned his courage, and continued. "That's the one," he whispered, pointing out the hole where he'd found the gold tube. It was still about 50 yards away, but Stanley was pretty sure it was the right hole. There was no need to risk going any closer. They climbed down into adjacent holes and waited for the camp to fall asleep. And that's where we're gonna stop today. We only have 6 or 7 chapters left until we're totally done this book. Oh my gosh. And this is what we will read next week, and then we'll be done. So crazy. Did you like it today? Let's see if anybody on Facebook enjoyed it today. I think everybody on Instagram liked it. I'm seeing lots and lots of likes on Instagram. Oh man, what do you think's going to happen? They went back to Camp Green Lake. They survived. They made it all the way to the mountain. They found Sam's onion patch, and they got to the top of Big Thumb. Now they're all the way back, right back to where Stanley thinks Kissing Cape Barlow's treasure is buried. It's crazy! Do you think they're going to get caught? Now you have to wait a whole week to read the ending. Oh, okay, so I don't know if you saw on Facebook already. It might not be posted yet. It might get posted within the next hour. But again, you don't have to print this. You could look at this on your phone or tablet and then just write down the answers on a piece of paper. But I made you guys a whole crossword puzzle this week. I thought that would be super duper fun. Even if you did this with a family member at home and they asked you the questions and you told them the answers and they could fill it in, I thought this would be really cool. The first question is, what Barfbag stepped on to get out of Camp Green Lake? So, number 1, whatever he stepped on to get out of Camp Green Lake is the answer to one of these crossword things. Very cool. And yeah, next week's going to be our last Holes Book Club. It'll be crazy. We're hoping we can do another one while we're all still at home. So keep an eye out. I think we might put up a vote to try and vote on our next book. So yeah, watch our Facebook and Instagram and everything for new stuff that we're putting out. And if you want to share your crossword, if you finish it, you can tag us on Facebook or Instagram too. That would be really fun. I hope you guys have a good afternoon, and I'll see you next week. Bye, guys.